Hey, hello, SUPA class. This is part two of the chapter 26 lecture. Yesterday you watched the beginning of the lecture on the early Cold War, and in that lecture we focused mostly on the early stages of the Cold War and how it impacted things like foreign policy. In this part of the lecture, we're going to start jumping into the early stages of the Cold War and really look how it kind of impacted life at home domestically, and also really just look at how American culture and society was changing in the post-World War II period. So we're actually going to start out on slide 8, which is 1950s American culture. And in here, this was a huge time period of economic boom. Okay, so the United States, we were really on the top of the world at this point economically, geopolitically. Our power was established, which was the way we concluded World War II. And what you started to see during this time period was, people wanted this concept of normalcy. And you started to see, the growth of the suburbs. Okay, and one thing you also need to understand is, the suburbs, this was a component, this was for white America. Minority populations were excluded from suburban life. They couldn't get mortgages. It was really what they called white flight. The suburbs was, when white Americans left cities, they lived in these suburban areas, and, minority populations were concentrated in American cities. You're going to read about that this week in Man-Child in the Promised Land. So what made the suburbs possible was the interstate highway system, because the interstate highways connected cities to cities, and the suburbs grew along those interstates. Also during this time period, this is the time of the baby boomers, right? So the baby boomers were that post-war, the kids born after World War II, and the baby boomers basically have really sent a shockwave, economic shockwave, really through the American economy. You had this explosion of children in the post-World War II period. Why? People came home and they wanted a normal life. The World War was over and they wanted to raise a family, and they kind of wanted this concept of normalcy. Well, in the beginning, you needed more, birthing units and hospitals, and then you needed more elementary schools, and as the kids got older, you needed more jobs and more colleges. Well, now the baby boomers, we need more Social Security money. They're impacting the Social Security system, and really, what became the new medium of information sharing during this generation was TV. Okay, it's the 1950s, the advent of the TV, when the TV became commonplace in the American home. Kind of like how over the last decade, the smartphone has kind of become commonplace in America. In the 1950s, it was the television. All right, and that's why you still see older people. I use my parents as a perfect example. They're in their 70s, so they came of age in the 50s. They watch TV news daily. It's unheard of for someone my age to well, at least in my case, to watch television news. I rarely watch it. All right, and it's just different generations. So moving on to slide 9, we're going to move on from 1950s American culture, and we're going to get into the Red Scare. The Red Scare is really this fear of communism at home. The color red is the color which is associated with communism. Now, mind you, remember during the Cold War, we were trying to contain communism. We did not want to see it spread abroad. We also didn't want it to influence, American government. HUAC gets created, the House of Un-American Activities, and basically it gave them the power to really try to hunt down communists, and people get subpoenaed and they had to answer questions. So if you think about that, it could allow people to go after political opponents if they disagreed with their political stance. And on the slide, it also dives into the 1947 National Security Act. And once again, what is this? This is really an advisory role to the president in regard to national defense. Well, what were we really trying to defend our country at home or the world against? And that was the spread of communism. Moving on to slide 10. The ultimate symbol of the fear of communism at home is really McCarthyism, which doesn't jump into it on this slide. But what you see here is, bless you, are pledges of loyalty pledges from trade unions. Getting people to pledge the fact that they're not communism. Because if you think about a union negotiates a contract and it deals with essentially like profit sharing and really distribution of wealth and income. It establishes the way wealth is distributed, and they would become the targets of many of the anti-communists, fighters in government. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, didn't like college campuses. Well, I mean, if you think about college, and you guys will be there soon, in college you're taught to think critically, you're taught to question, you're taught to analyze, you're taught to, create arguments. And, J. Edgar Hoover would make the argument that the college campuses are teaching people, to distrust government and to challenge government, and it's going to destroy our morals, our customs, and our traditions. And really, what you see here is all of this fear. It's like fear of free speech. You say the wrong thing, you don't want to be labeled as a communist. Now, mind you, class, at this time, what's going on in this country? You have people getting lynched because of the color of their skin. You have people who can't vote because of the color of their skin. There were a lot of policies in the United States which were legal, which were incredibly unconstitutional, but we shouldn't question government. So when we think about it, was it really fear of communism, or was it fear of shutting down political opponents? Using communism as a chance to shut down political opponents. Moving on to slide 11. Moving on to the Cold War at home, and here's where it launches into McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin is the biggest figure of the Red Scare. He goes out and he goes on television, and because TV was the medium, like I said, of people get information, and he holds in his hand, I've got a list in my hand of a few hundred card-carrying communist members which work in the State Department. It was all bogus, but he was exploiting people's fear. There was never one communist identified in the State Department. And, ultimately, the TV would bring McCarthy up and it would bring McCarthy down. It would be when McCarthy went after high-ranking officials in the United States military where people were like, wait a second, you mean the same military which just saved the world? He was made to look like a fool on television. And I mean, you've seen it, with celebrities and people today. TV can bring you up and the media can bring you up, but the media can also bring you, crashing down. So when we look at it, was he really hunting communists, or was he hunting his political opponents, by tagging them as communists? If people wanted to criticize Cold War policies, if they wanted to criticize Republican politics, well, label them as communist. People don't like that. People don't like communism right now. That's the big fear. Moving on to slide 12, the Korean War. Okay, so here is the first big Cold War conflict. North Korea would invade South Korea. The United Nations, led primarily by U.S. forces, jumps in, and we basically push the war back up into North Korea, where it's close to the border with China. Then you get, support from North Korea gets support from the communists, and the war kind of gets pushed down right back to where it started. And the war goes on for a few years. It cost the U.S. about $100 billion, which helps our deficit balloon, and it ultimately ends in a stalemate. It ends in a ceasefire. Technically the war there's never been a peace treaty. It's just a ceasefire agreement. The North Korean and South Korean border is the most heavily manned border by soldiers on Earth. I believe we still have 50,000 soldiers there. I mean, who knows with the COVID crisis what's going on. But but what were we doing there? We were trying to stop the spread of communism. We did not want to see communism spread to South Korea. They were an ally, so we go in and we fight a massive conflict to do so. Are we successful? Yes. Do we turn North Korea democratic? No. But does South Korea fall to communism? Does not. Okay, they're still a democratic ally today. That's it. That was slide 12. That's it for chapter 26 lecture. I hope this finds you well, and I hope you guys enjoy reading Man Child in the Promised Land this week. And I hope you guys are all doing great. Take care.